Hello, thank you for joining me today as we continue our current series of webinars, which address how you manage when things get somewhat more awkward than normal. The subject of this talk is twofold. Firstly, change management under pressure, and then, in the assumption that things are not going too great, a reminder on how to communicate with regulators. So this first part is change control. And we must remember that as an operator within Europe, you have an authorization. And as the holder of that authorization for manufacturing, you have an obligation to follow the requirements of EU GMP. So this presentation is from me, from the perspective of an ex-MHRA inspector of 11 years. So let's start with a refresher on what is actually required. In terms of change control, the requirements are detailed in Chapter 1 initially, and this spelled out in Section 1.4, which details the fundamental requirements of the pharmaceutical quality system. In Section 12 of 1.4, it says that the arrangements need to be in place for a prospective evaluation, so that's an in-advance assessment of planned changes, and you need to take into account the considerations of regulatory notification and approval. And then in Section 13, it states that after the implementation, you need to do another assessment to make sure you met your objectives and there was no unintended deleterious impact on product quality. And by that, we mean an accidental negative effect on your product quality. The detailed elements relating to change control are in Annex 15. So starting off in the principles section, here it requires that the change is formally documented and the impact of validation or control strategy should be considered. But section 11 is where you'll find the absolute detail. So the change control has to be within your pharmaceutical quality system and your procedures need to detail the process. The requirements do specify some changes that need to be addressed, but then it has the glorious catch-all of any other change as well. So there's no escape routes from using change control. If you're using a design space, change control still applies, and the process needs to be based on a risk management system, so you understand the potential impact of the change and the importance of that change. Furthermore, the change needs to go through an approval process, and before closing a change, you need to conduct a review to positively confirm that the impact of the change has been demonstrated. And then finally, when appropriate, you need to evaluate the effectiveness of the change. How you determine what is appropriate is not specified, and this could be justified on the basis of risk. So now we're clear on what must be done, the next thing to consider are the actual decision makers. When people are under pressure, they can make poor decisions. These can be emotionally driven, and to the individual making that decision, they can seem to be the only available choice at the time. If you're interested in understanding more about what drives that decision-making process, I can recommend an available video by Martin Lush. This addresses decision-making when under pressure, looking at the biological drivers for why people respond in the way that they do in such circumstances. The initial talk, Judgment Calls, is from 2016. But Martin followed this up in 2017 with two 6 to Fix in 6-minute talks. These are so valid for people in today's situations and are definitely more relevant than ever. Martin shares his personal garrote methodology for decision-making and gives an example of putting structure into that decision-making process and how it can work. So now we need to focus on the process itself. And indeed, let's start with the decision of whether we follow our actual pharmaceutical quality system. A surprisingly common fault for people under pressure is that they start with the very poor decision of not to follow their PQS. What they tend to be saying is that we won't bother with change control and we'll sort it out later with a deviation if somebody raises it. You see this in companies where the change control system has become too complex to cope with, or the quality assurance unit has become too weak to handle operations. But the minute you make that decision, what you're saying to your team and to your colleagues is that nothing in the pharmaceuticals quality system really matters. It can be ignored when you want to. People under pressure tell themselves that now is the time to take risks and just try something, to be brave, to be courageous. But you need to do that within the context of a controlled pharmaceutical manufacturing operation. And the reality is that if you ignore it, you are storing up problems for the future. Not just in terms of having the unapproved change, but also in terms of the quality of the change that you may choose to make. You may not have considered the full impact. So having decided to follow your pharmaceutical quality system, look carefully at your change control RACI. Who is responsible? Who is accountable? Who do you consult? Who do you inform? The responsible do the work, the accountable delegate the work and can be the final sign-off. They're often the managerial representative for the process. Consult will be consulted on the basis of their expertise, and informed need to be kept in the loop on the project. So either these are the people who are going to be executing it in the future, or they're the people whose departments or costs it can affect. Now, at a time of intense pressure on the organisation, the decision makers within the process of approving proposed changes need to be the people who really matter. You need to cut out levels of bureaucracy and get the right people to make the right decisions. These decision makers need to have true authority. When they're reviewing the changes, they can't do the easy ones first. We need people who are going to take the difficult changes first. And remember, if you have a change control committee, they are not meant to be trying to solve the change, but to assess the suitability of doing it. You need to be able to take the information available at that point in time and make the best decision you can. Don't worry about going back and adjusting course. You've done the best you could at the time with the information that was available to hand. Fundamentally, we need to consider whether we really need to make this change. At a time when there's pressure all around, if you can avoid making the change, do so. You need to really carefully consider the resource planning. If you launch, have you really got the resources to deliver and operate the change? So look carefully at whether the change is a must-do or a nice-to-have. And if it's a nice-to-do, nice-to-have, then park it for the future. Then we need to have a really strict process for assessing the proposed must-dos. You've got to have your risk assessment process looking at severity, occurrence and detectability, and determine whether the changes are really serious, moderately so, or less so. At a time when we're under intense pressure, the lower level changes in terms of severity should join the nice-to-do changes and be parked for the future sometime. If you decide to go ahead with the change proposal, then aim to keep them simple. Break the change controls down into a series of small change controls. Go bite size. It can feel much more manageable as a series of changes rather than one huge unmanageable mass. But make sure you put the overarching change in place that ties together all of the smaller change control numbers, the so-called umbrella change control. Now is the time for the leadership and for the quality unit to be positive. It's very easy for negativity and pessimism to come in at a time of intense pressure. The creation of a positive measure and as positive environment as possible will help to bring about engagement with potential changes. People need that can-do attitude. The acceptance of change at a time of intense pressure can be very difficult to achieve. People will simply default to the old process, even if they want to support the new process. It may help to remember perfection is the enemy of good, and good is good enough. It can sound trite, but we're not seeking perfection. What we want to do once we embark on a change is ensure that we get it done and we get it effective. So at this time, it's useful to look at the science or logic behind engagement with change. Within the UK, the Behavioural Insight team, initially with the government, looked at how to get the public en masse to engage with policy changes with their methodology called EAST. People generally favour convenience and ease, seeking to achieve their goals with the least possible effort. So when we make changes, we need them to be in line with the EAST methodology. Easy, you want a simple process. Attractive, you want it to attract attention. We're likely to do something that attracts our attention, that we are drawn towards. And the ways of doing this include the use of images, colour, personalisation. We want it to be social, so it's in the interest of all to follow, but also communicate that this is something that most people can achieve. And make sure your communications are timely, that you implement the change at a time that people are most likely to be receptive. You need to communicate before, during, and after the change. You cannot really over-communicate. The more personal you can make that communication, the better. You want the communication to be short, succinct, colourful, targeted to the right people, and personal to them. Then they are more likely to engage. The second talk within this section is communication with the regulators. Within the UK, we have a Defective Medicines Reporting Centre for obligatory or required reporting. And a few years ago, they detailed what kind of communication they're looking for from the holders of marketing authorization. And this advice holds for all license holders as good practice when dealing with regulators. Firstly, what is required? The legal requirement is for manufacturers to report any defect that may result in a recall of stock or restriction of supply. This includes unlicensed medicines and stability studies, so you make sure you report an apparent out of trend well before you report a subsequent out of specification. In terms of these types of change, they include three main aspects. So the first is where there's an obvious failure to meet the requirements of the marketing authorization. Secondly, there's errors that could cause confusion, so perhaps mistakes within printed packaging. And thirdly, defects that could cause hazards to health. Now, these can be wide-ranging, everything from sterility issues, potential environmental monitoring or cross-contamination issues, through to glass particles. But you need to think cautiously here. Your products should never cause harm. And remember, you do need to report defects for released batches, even if the stock is still within your supply chain and not yet on the market. So when to report? Section 8.15 of EU GMP states they've got to be reported in a timely manner. But timely is a vague term and it depends on who you're talking to. You need to focus on the potential severity of the risk. If you're talking something serious, it's got to be very quick, so 1 to 2 working days, because it can be necessary to take market action immediately to protect public health. And you're better getting in an initial communication and then update, rather than withhold whilst you investigate. So thirdly, we look at how to report. You want to call to explain complex issues, but it's easier if a report's been provided up front. If you do speak, a follow-up email with all of the information and confirmation of the conversation should be sent afterwards. The information should be concise and clear summary, and be very clear about the actual defect. Photographs can really help. You're going to provide all of the batch details, along with a patient risk assessment and an assessment of risk of shortages and your recommended action. In your communications, be careful about sweeping statements without facts to support them. You may state that it is an isolated event, but you need the facts to back that up. Don't use company-specific acronyms. And to finish, I would just add a watch out. As a site under stress, it can be tempting to promise the world to the agency, but it's not sensible if you cannot deliver. When you make your regulatory commitments, you need to be able to deliver on those, because failure to meet regulatory commitments results in those issues being escalated in terms of severity and findings at subsequent visits. Be realistic in your commitments and remember again that good is good enough. I hope that you found this of interest, and if you have any questions, please do contact us through PharmaMail. And remember that the NSF Resource Library is a superb collection of supportive information available to everyone. Thank you.